Thank you. It is great to be here and wonderful to see such a packed house on such a beautiful evening out there in New York. This is, of course, the final event in our series on wonder. So I want to start with a bit of history here. Back in the early 19th century, the world was awash in wonder. The great English astronomer John Herschel found it in everyday objects. He said, "To the natural philosopher, there is no natural object unimportant or trifling, a soap bubble, an apple, a pebble. He walks in the midst of wonders." And around the same time, the chemist Humphrey Davy wrote, "Nothing is so fatal to the progress of the human mind as to suppose our views of science are ultimate, that there are no mysteries in nature, that our triumphs are complete, and that there are no new worlds to conquer." The historian Richard Holmes has called this period, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Age of Wonder. For Europeans then, this was a time of many new scientific discoveries and also exploration. It was when Captain James Cook made his around-the-world voyages and Darwin sailed to the Galapagos. Venturing out to the limits of the known world went hand in hand with new science. Of course, all kinds of things have changed since then, but I would say that we are still in an age of wonder today, although the frontiers have shifted to outer space, to the depths of the ocean, and in the world of science, to quantum mechanics and machine intelligence, the human mind. There is still so much that we don't understand. And so we're going to talk this evening about the known and unknown parts of our world and how experiences of awe and wonder still compel us to explore the edges of science and medicine. And we have three wonderful people here to help us understand all of this. So let me introduce them. Marcelo Gleiser is a theoretical physicist at Dartmouth College. His current research interests include the physics of the early universe, the nature of physical complexity, and questions related to the origin of life on Earth and elsewhere in the universe. He's also published widely on the interface between particle physics and cosmology. His books include The Simple Beauty of the Unexpected, A Natural Philosopher's Quest for Trout and the Meaning of Everything, and The Island of Knowledge, The Limits of Science and the Search for Meaning. He was also the co-founder and a regular contributor to the NPR Science and Culture blog 13.7. Tanya Lombroso is a professor of psychology at Princeton University, where she's also an associate of the philosophy department. Her research aims to address foundational questions about cognition using the empirical tools of cognitive psychology and the conceptual tools of analytic philosophy. Her work focuses on explanation and understanding, social cognition, causal reasoning, and folk epistemology. She also studies intuitive beliefs about causation, moral responsibility, and the nature of knowledge. She has blogged about psychology, philosophy, and cognitive science for Psychology Today and also for NPR's 13.7. Gavin Francis is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, Scotland, where he writes and practices medicine. After qualifying as a physician, he spent 10 years traveling, during which time he visited all 7 continents. His first book, True North, travels in Arctic Europe, explores the history of Europe's expansion northwards, from the first Greek explorers to the polar expeditions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His other books include Adventures in Human Being and Shapeshifters on Medicine and Human Change. He's also a regular contributor to The Guardian, the London Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books. Welcome, all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Steve.
you.
So, Marcelo, let me start with you. How do experiences of awe and wonder figure into your own work?
My work. So the kind of work I do is looking at the universe and trying to confront the mystery of why we're here and how the universe came to be. So these are very, very big questions. And those are questions which are much older than science. And I would say that the reason why I do this kind of physics as opposed to, say, designing a faster chip for the next iPhone or laser physics, which are all very important topics, is because I am drawn to this existential question, since I was a very little young man. I think when I was a teenager, I started to ponder these things, and I quickly realized that science, in particular physics, and Einstein was mentioned here, and I would say that he was a very important influence in my formative years, just because he was not just doing the physics that basically changed the way we think about the world and about space and time, but he was also pondering the questions of existence through his science. And so I realized that there was a bridge between doing all the math and the equations and trying to figure out things like why galaxies, how the galaxies evolve, or how long stars live, and why we're here. And I never looked back. So in a sense, my search for these questions about the universe are essentially an existential quest to understand the meaning of our lives.
The meaning of life. That's
Yeah.
all. Yeah. Okay. Tanya, what about you? How do these questions of awe and wonder figure into what you do?
So one neat thing about being a cognitive scientist is that the object I study is the human mind. And so observing my own reactions to aspects of science has actually, in some cases, been a stimulus for my own research. So I find it fascinating that we can't just, it's not just that we don't yet have good explanations for things like human consciousness and all sorts of aspects of human experience. I think we don't have a good sense of what a good explanation would look like. And that itself is an interesting feature of human psychology. How does the human mind think about the world such that we do or don't have a sense of what we can explain or understand? And so for me, that's prompted a line of research that looks at why it is that in general, we think it's pretty straightforward that psychology might explain depth perception or motor control or how it is that we discern color. And yet we have a really hard time imagining that we could have a satisfying psychological explanation for moral behavior or belief in God or certain aspects of conscious experience. And so that's a topic of study that you can study. Why is the human mind like that? And to the extent that we discover that there might be reasons about human cognition that make us more or less inclined to think that we can approach the world, what does that tell us about our ability as scientists to actually understand those aspects about the world? So those are all fascinating questions that I think about in my research.
So I'm going to bring in kind of a bit of a historical angle here, because I know, Gavin, you have thought about some of these questions. There is sort of this bigger question of why do we even have this capacity for wonder? It's not obvious. I mean, it doesn't seem to serve any particular biological imperative. Yeah. So why are we compelled to ask these kinds of questions?
Well, it's a $1 million question, absolutely. I think it's instructive to look at the way children explore and learn about the world. And that gives us a little bit of an insight into its utility more broadly in life. You know, if you look at the way curiosity drives learning in children, how easily children are astonished and amazed, and how their own sense of wonder drives them on to learn new things, I think that goes a long way to answering why we have it. You know, my own work as a medical doctor is very much inspired, enthused, motivated, continues on because of a kind of amazement and astonishment at how the human body works, how it can sometimes go wrong, and how we can use our understanding of science to improve people's lives in really very simple, practical ways. You know, when I was at medical school, every day seemed like a kind of unfolding of a catalogue of wonder. You know, you would sit in a biochemistry class and somebody would tell you, oh, this is how hemoglobin tilts and shifts in order to pick up oxygen in the lungs and release it to tissues. Then you would go and sit in an anatomy class and they would explain how the heart folds and coils upon itself from two tubes as it grows in the embryo. And every day would bring new incredible insights like that. And being able to practice with the human body as Tanya, you said you're so blessed to have actually the subject of your study as part of your own experience. It's similar being a doctor, because the subject of your inquiry, the subject of your interest is always there before you.
Do you mention the experience that a lot of the children have? Not a lot. I think all children have of that wonder. And I think all of us who've been parents have, you know, we've seen young kids, maybe, I don't know, ages 4 to 8 or so, with those never-ending why questions. Why is the world this way? And it goes on and on and on. And I guess I'm wondering, do you think those are different than the kinds of questions that we have as adults, or is it just kind of an extension of those why questions that we had when we were very young? And really, this is directed to any of you.
Yeah, well, one thing you do find empirically is that when kids ask why questions, they usually don't have an immediate goal in mind. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they're just curious. They just want to know why that's a feature of the world. And I think one thing that you find with adults is that it starts to feel like a luxury to get to ask those kinds of questions. We tend to ask, why do I need to put this number on line 5 of my tax return? Right? Where insofar as we have curiosity there, it's very instrumental. It's motivated by wanting to solve a particular problem. We're not really seeking knowledge for its own sake. And so I think something that we often try to cultivate as adults is that kind of childhood curiosity and wonder. But I think you do see that as a developmental shift, typically.
So you're saying that we often, as adults, we lose that sense of wonder.
We can. It doesn't have to happen. We can do things to cultivate it. But I think a lot of us find, I find this even as a scientist, I feel like I have to make space to get to approach things in that way where I'm not thinking about the immediate goal of learning about this. I'm thinking about, learning for its own sake.
It makes me think of that wonderful line from Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson famously said if she had one gift from the good fairy, it would be to give all children an unshakable sense of wonder that would last throughout their lives. And that would drive and inspire them, and would drive and inspire all kinds of new learnings in all disciplines, if we could all hold on to that sense of wonder. I think it comes from, it appears in a gap between something that we are dimly appreciate, has a pattern or a harmony or an elegance about it, but we don't fully understand how that arises, and that drives the curiosity to learn how it works, how it's put together.
Yeah, so we, as children, we're natural explorers. That's exactly what we do. We are throwing stuff against the wall to see if it breaks. Of course, the parents get kind of crazy with this, but those are experiments which are really an engagement with the process of discovery. I am here in this world. I don't know exactly how the world works, and I'm going to play with it. So there is an aspect of playfulness, which is so important. And those why questions, they kind of complement that. And they're asking us these questions because they need to know in order to continue this sense of exploration. But I think what tends to happen, and I think Rachel Carlson would be one that would say that, is that with the educational process, what happens is that we become trained to shift the why questions into how questions. Mm-hmm. And that shift, this sort of pragmatism that comes with the act of learning in schools, you have to do this task and not that task, but I'm really interested in that task, but it doesn't matter. This is the problem set that you have to solve, and it's due tomorrow, so get going. That is the way education works, but it sort of forces you to kind of focus in directions where your mind may not want to go, but that is, in a sense, and so as an educator, I think it's so important that we always tease this sense of wonderment when you're learning a subject, so that appetite for being marveled, in love, passionate about the mystery of existence. There's so much stuff we don't know, doesn't die away. And perhaps scientists, to a certain extent, they manage to cultivate that. They kind of survive the onslaught. And there was a very famous physicist called Isidore Rabi who says that the physicists, I think I would say all scientists, but he was a physicist, we are the Peter Pans of society because we just don't want to grow up. We want to keep asking these questions, And so, in a sense, we have so much to learn from the children.
Yeah, there's the playfulness too. The great psychoanalyst Winnicott, he talked about how children can operate in two parallel universes. They know when they're playing a game that they're not really in a spaceship, but they are in a spaceship, but they're not in a spaceship. And they live in this kind of imaginative realm where their cardboard box is a spaceship. And the best scientists maybe manage to hold on to that possibility of playfulness, of living in two realms of possibility and seeing where it clicks, so that the how questions that only come with more training start to appear.
Do you think there are certain fields in science or medicine that are especially conducive to eliciting these questions or these experiences of wonder?
So here's one reason to think that there might be. If you think about what we know about human psychology, so there's good evidence that we have a way of sort of reasoning about other people. This is called folk psychology, and we have a way of reasoning about biological organisms and life, and that's called folk biology. And we have a way of thinking about, medium-sized physical things that move around, which is our folk physics. What we really don't have a good sense for in terms of our intuitive psychology is the relationship between those things. And so when you get to the boundaries between these, I think you really start to have a mismatch between what we want to know about the world and what we're well equipped to understand given our psychology. So if you think about the boundary between psychology and biology, we're thinking about things like how you think about the human mind and human consciousness and human experience in biological terms, in terms of the brain. If you look back historically, there was real tension about how to think about life in more physical terms. Life seemed like something that must be a special extra spirit or essence, and how on earth could you give a physical description of that, right? So I think at the boundaries between these areas, we're really forced to confront these cases where we have the kinds of gaps in our knowledge that really induce awe and wonder.
Which makes you then wonder if our educational institutions are set up to ask those boundary questions, because often it's so focused on the discipline of, whether it's biology or physics or whatever. It's sort of, is there enough cross-pollination of ideas?
I would say one thing about American education, which is, I think, quite wonderful, having grown up in a different country, which is this notion of liberal arts. I'm a big enthusiast of liberal arts, the sense that it doesn't matter what you're going to major in. So if you're in college, you're going to be declaring your major as a sophomore, right? But you have to still take, let's say you're going to do studio art, but you have to take a course in introphysics, and you have to look at cinema and philosophy, and that gives an opportunity. And what happens a lot of times, as you probably know, is that kids come into the school saying, I am going to be an engineer. And so I'm in pre-law and I'm pre-med. And of course, then they take their first philosophy or psychology course and they get blown away and said, no, I'm not going to be a pre-med. I want to actually go that way because, this is still an age of discovery, a self-discovery. So being exposed to different ways of knowing, it's a very enriching thing. And I think that's something that must be preserved here and should actually spread more and more, because it's one way of kind of igniting a little bit this sense of wonder,
So Gavin, you are a physician, and I'm wondering how some of these ideas play out in your work. I mean, as you look at people's bodies, I know there are the extraordinary cases that you must, puzzle over as you're trying to figure out someone's health issues, but there are probably all kinds of just everyday cases. And I'm wondering if those also spark wonder for you.
Well, one of the wonderful things about working in medicine is that it has this extraordinary range from molecular to the biochemical to the physiological to the, psychological, neuroscientific, and the social. So that you feel sometimes as if just a typical medical clinic, and when you're going from thinking about the biochemical to the wider psychosocial and governmental policies of what's going on. But I think that to stay really keyed in to the value of your work to the individual, having a kind of really powerful sense of the unique, I keep coming back to this sense, but having an awe of the fact that the physiology all works is something that for me is very, very powerful.
So give me an example of that. So something that I might take for granted, you marvel at.
So, for example, if somebody comes into one of my clinics and they've got a problem with their eye, one of the things that I might need to do is switch off all the lights, use an ophthalmoscope, and gaze into the fundus of somebody's retina. And it never ceases, even after practicing for 20 years, it never ceases to strike me as a most extraordinarily wonderful experience to be able to directly visualize a capillary bed in the back of somebody's eye and be able to tell all these kinds of things about their health from that vision of the back of their eye. You can tell about diabetes, you can tell about blood pressure, you can see all kinds of things about somebody's health from the back of their eye. And I suppose that's an example of where you take a very mundane experience, somebody having a problem with their vision, and you just flip it by doing something which is unusual, looking at it in a new way, rather than just looking at a Snellen chart and counting down the acuity, but visualizing the eye, that restores it to something else. You realize this is a walking, talking, breathing organism, human being, made up of all these capillaries all over the body, and I'm getting a chance to have a look at some of them.
I don't know if you've ever seen that drawing that Isaac Newton made of he was trying to figure out
putting needles
he put
into
a
the back of
needle
his
in his
eye.
own
Yeah, yeah.
eye to figure out how light works, and I always thought, wow, that's
Another-
taking it to an extreme.
Another example is when you take a slit lamp and you put on a green light on the slit lamp and examine somebody's cornea and conjunctiva. And the capillaries in that part of the sclera of your eye are so narrow that you can see individual red corpuscles moving through them because the green light makes the corpuscles look black. And so you can see corpuscle by corpuscle somebody's heart beating because they're pulsatile. And that's a real kind of wonderful revelation to happen just in an ordinary clinic room.
So, Marcelo, in physics, I mean, you've already alluded to the existential, the why questions, but what are some that come up in your field that relate to this capacity for wonder?
Well, I don't even have to be too technical about this. I think everyone in this room have looked at the skies, right? And wondered about, okay, so there are stars there, all these points of light, and what are they, and how they came to be. And if you start to learn a little more about them, you realize them, but wait, their light has been traveling for a while. And so the sun, for example, light takes about 8 minutes to get from the sun to here. So it's 150 million kilometers. So it's a long trip, That means that if the sun exploded right now, we would only find out 8 minutes from now, but would be, of course, the last thing you would ever know, right? And we're like, oh, it exploded, bye, it's the end. And then you start to go deeper into the sky, right? And you start to realize that as you look to farther objects, you're really looking into the past of the universe. And you start getting light from objects that actually have sent that light before we existed. And then you look at Andromeda, which is the next galaxy to us, our neighbor, much bigger than we are. In fact, it's coming towards us, and we're going to collide in about 500 million years. I mean, galactic collisions are not quite like head-on collisions with cars, but they can do a lot of interesting things, like create lots of new stars and stuff. But anyway, Andromeda is not about 2 million light years away from us. So these are things that when you look at Andromeda now, you're actually seeing it 2 million years ago, when there were no sapiens here, we had our hominids. And so it is really a time machine to the past of our existence and the existence of the universe. And to me, that sort of understanding, which came because we did study the how. So I'm not just saying the how is not important, attention to that. Of course, we need to know the techniques and everything. But when you learn these things, how could you not contemplate the skies and say, oh, look at that star. Maybe there are some beings looking at us, asking if there is anybody alive in that solar system. And that to me is a wonderful question, And of course, some of the questions we ask, and this is a very personal point, which is, to me, the questions that are most significant are the questions which are unanswerable. So, for example, questions that have no answers. So I call them unknowables. And one of them is the origin of the universe itself. We cannot, and you guys can ask me, afterwards, why in the Q&A, we cannot, through normal science or any kind of science that we know of, understand conclusively how the universe came to be.
Doesn't the science kind of break down in that first fraction of a second?
Yes, there are lots of problems that break down on that first second, and you can speculate, and that's awesome, and you should, but you can never know. And that, to me, is an amazing thing. That does not stop people from wanting to learn, but embracing the fact that we don't have answers for everything, to me, is an essential aspect of being human, and to rescuing a little bit of humility, when we look out there. And so these are questions that are, to me, very inspirational.
So one thing that I'm struck by, but the examples that you've given mostly, is that they strike me as very intellectual areas of inquiry. And I guess I'm wondering if wonder, and I would throw in the experience of awe as well, is that fundamentally an intellectual process, or is it an emotional process? Tanya?
So I do think those have been the examples, but I think some of the ones that have to do with the human body in particular might be very visceral, right? People will report having an awe experience at the birth of a child, for example. And There's some ways in which that's very cerebral, but there's a lot of ways in which that's extremely physical and corporal and so on. So I do think awe and wonder can span the spectrum. One thing that I think about as a psychologist is how do these emotional experiences actually translate into behavior? Because that's what's going to be important if we want to explain human behavior, if we want to think about the role of these kinds of emotions in our everyday lives, in scientific progress, and so on. And I think you might be able to think of something like a spectrum from something like awe to curiosity, where when we experience awe, it's often triggered by a sense of there being a really profound gap in our understanding that we don't even know how to begin to address, right? It's not really clear how an awe experience would translate into some particular behavior. When you experience curiosity, you're also recognizing some sort of gap in your understanding, some gap that you want to fill. But that's usually much more closely tied to some immediate action. You might ask somebody a question. You might go look to see what's on the other side of that screen if you're curious about what's on the other side of the screen. There's going to be all sorts of immediate ways it will translate into your behavior. And so maybe there's a bit of a spectrum here where it's not about being intellectual versus not intellectual. It's about being something more like the basic research wing versus a more applied sort of research wing, where on the basic research side, it might feel more intellectual because it's more removed from our everyday behaviors and actions, and we don't yet know what the consequences are going to be of pursuing our awe or thinking about something.
And could I ask if the roots of the two different words are possibly got something to do with our history of religion as well, cultural history of religion, whether there's a religious aspect to awe in terms of people feeling kind of overwhelmed by something almost divine in the first usages of the word? I don't know. I'm curious.
I can't tell you the answer historically for the usage of the word, but there has been research looking at the link between the experience of awe and religiosity, and also between awe and science. And I think an important distinction in thinking about that research is that awe is something that I think can have a positive or negative valence. So you can experience awe in a way that is really destabilizing and kind of negative and feels very uncomfortable. And that sense of awe tends to make people want to reach out for something that will give them some kind of order or structure in their world. And for many people, not for everyone, for many people, that's some religious belief system. And so if you take religious people and you induce an awe experience like that, that tends to reaffirm their religious beliefs. But there's also a more positive valence to awe or wonder or various kinds of uncertainty, where you recognize that you don't know something, but you think, that's interesting. I want to try to figure this out. You're not trying to sort of retreat from the uncertainty, you're moving towards it. And I think that's a very characteristic emotion that scientists experience, or people who have scientific curiosity, where we simultaneously have to appreciate all of that we don't know in order to be good scientists. But at the same time, not turn away from that uncertainty. We sort of have to walk into it and try to figure things out. And so I think you can get simultaneously awe going either towards a more sort of scientific approach or a more religious approach, depending on the valence and the belief system of the individuals and what they're going to find comforting in the face of the negative.
So are you suggesting that scientific awe is more or less a positive experience, whereas religious awe is not?
I think that if you look at, so here, I'll tell you, I'll tread on safe territory and tell you the empirical findings.
You don't have to be
and then I'll
treading
speculate.
on safe territory.
So here's what some of the data tells us. If you bring people into a lab and you try to induce an experience of awe by, for example, showing them giant nature scenes that make them feel like they're an insignificant speck in the universe, that tends to reaffirm their religious beliefs if they have them. By contrast, if you look at who are the sorts of people who tend to experience awe in their everyday lives, who are the sorts of people who feel like there's wonder everywhere when they look at nature, when they look at patterns in the world and so on, those people tend to be more scientifically inclined in terms of their belief systems. So that's what the data tells us. And one interpretation is that the more uncomfortable, destabilizing kind of uncertainty associated with awe is something that's going to make you want to grab onto something that gives you a firm structure in your life. Doesn't have to be religion. For many people, it is religion. Whereas the more positive version is maybe going to be something that's more like an impetus to inquiry. It's going to stimulate you to learn more. That doesn't have to be through scientific means, but it often is through scientific means.
But there is also a different kind of awe that, so if you really look at the word religion, right? So the word religion really comes from religare, which means to reconnect with something, right? And then the question is, what is it that people are reconnecting with, in this religious? So you may talk about religious awe from organized religions perspectives, and that's fine. And there are people that go into the hills to kind of have some sort of communion with whatever God they believe in. But you also have some sort of secular spirituality that drives a lot of people, especially nowadays in this world that we're living in, where they don't believe in any particular set of religious principles, but they feel deeply spiritual. And they go out into the world, to connect with this sense of reverence for what you said, being, in something bigger, something somewhat incomprehensible, and yet very, it could be fearsome some ways, and I think he has been, in the past. Now a little less because we know more about volcanoes and cyclones and stuff like that. But there is something very native and very visceral about our need to feel this connection, even if it's completely secular, And I have to say, I do this. I go out and I try to find this sense of awe in a completely non-rational, has nothing to do with the physics, is really about, I love running in mountains, and to me that running in mountains is sort of my going to my temple.
So you seek it out. I mean,
I seek it out.
Absolutely. You're trying to cultivate this experience in your own life.
Yeah, and I'm seeking it really, and it's like almost like an act of pilgrimage, and I sometimes even joke, on Sunday mornings, instead of going to the synagogue or to the church, I go to run up in the trails in the forest, because that is how I connect with this sense of awe that I feel it's part of who I am.
There's a big overlap, isn't there, with the kind of ideas of the romantic sublime as well. This, the beauty, the immensity, the incomprehensibility of natural forces. But I'm interested that there's possibly another kind of sense of wonder, which is much more kind of man-made or made by groups or societies of people. The first time I came to New York 20 odd years ago, I remember coming out of Penn Station and just being struck by awe. I grew up in a small village in Scotland. I'd been to London once or twice, but I'd never seen anything like this.
Was this an experience of terror then?
I was like, how do these buildings stay up? Surely this isn't possible. This isn't practical. And now, as the years have gone by and I have become older and hopefully wiser, I have less of that awe. I don't get that awe at these buildings so much, but I still get a sense of awe at the crowds of diverse peoples from all over the world speaking all kinds of languages. That still kind of gives me a kind of thrill or a kick or a hit. And I'm interested in whether we can get that kind of sense of wonder or awe from something that's so self-evidently man-made. Civil engineers build these buildings and they build them with physical forces that they understand and can predict. So there's not much mystery there, but yet it can still induce awe. In fact, today, just out the window, we can see Brooklyn Bridge from here. And to bring in poets rather than only scientists, there's that beautiful, there's a beautiful Whitman poem, isn't there, about crossing Brooklyn Ferry. He talks about that sense of awe at the crowds, moving through the crowds, crossing over, coming to Manhattan, these surging crowds of different kinds of people speaking every language. And I think that's just as valid. I really think it is.
So we've been talking about different kinds of awe. There's religious awe, scientific awe. We could talk about the awe that people have experiencing art, whether it's looking at a magnificent painting or listening to a performance of music. Are these more or less all the same kinds of experiences, or are there different versions of awe?
Looking at me.
Looking at the same.
So there's definitely, it's largely an open empirical question. But my view is that there's probably not a lot of value in trying to draw sharp boundaries between these different types of emotions. What's probably going to be a more valuable approach is to identify dimensions along which they vary. And you might sometimes have something that's a little bit gray. So we already talked about one dimension along which they vary, which is sort of a positive or negative valence. Is it an experience that you enjoy, or is it one that you find somewhat aversive? Another one that it's already come up is, to what extent is it tied to behavior? Is it something that sort of makes you stand back and not engage, or is it something that really motivates you to engage with the world in some way, be it through exploration or through some sort of social interaction and so on? Another one that psychologists talk about is the extent to which an emotion really focuses you on yourself versus dissolves boundaries between yourself and your environment, whether that environment is the natural world or a social community. And awe is typically thought to be one of these emotions that actually dissolves these kinds of boundaries and really makes you focus on your relationship to your environment and being sort of a small piece of that. And so I think we can identify some of these important dimensions. And we're going to find that there's going to be prototypical awe is going to look a little bit different from, say, prototypical curiosity and prototypical wonder and prototypical pride and joy and so on. But then drawing the sharp boundaries, I think, is not going to do us a whole lot of good.
Do you think the experience of awe pretty much always makes you feel like your sense of self recedes, and then you feel more of that connection with the oneness of the world? Is that kind of intrinsic to the experience of awe?
The way psychologists characterize awe, it does tend to be. Part of the experience of awe is a sort of literal or metaphorical vastness that you encounter. And so you're really seeing yourself as a very small part of that, where the boundaries between you and that aren't going to be the salient part of the way that you're thinking. I think what's important there, though, is that it can be metaphorical vastness. So you might have an experience going to the Grand Canyon or a really dramatic mountain where it really is literal vastness, but you can also have it, I think, in the sorts of cases that you describe, or even just thinking about the way in which your own experience might just be sort of one dot in the space of all possible experiences that humans are having right now. All of those more metaphorical notions of vastness can also have that kind of consequence.
Because it makes me think, thinking about all of the environmental problems that we face right now, and it seems like there's this huge need to have some sense of connection to the planetary well-being. And I'm wondering if there's some way of tapping into this experience of awe that would motivate environmental work, for instance, environmental activism. I don't know.
Exactly. I think that's why more people should be out there, and flirt with the wild, essentially, because I think that's a disconnect that is going on in our lives and is that we just forgot about, not all of us, but a lot of us, just forgot about our relationship to nature, that we are actually, yes, we feel really small when we look at the vastness of the universe, but we're carrying the universe within ourselves. So there is, you are made of stardust, right? You are, and those stars existed before the sun was born. So we're really old people, we're like 5 billion years old. And I think this sort of connectivity is awe-inspiring, but we lose that because so much of our lives are being sort of diverted into the more pragmatic, the more material, and then we forget that, all of this is only possible because there is a world out there that gives us the energy and the supplies that we need to sustain this kind of lifestyle. But it's not a forever game. And we need to kind of wake up to that.
Yeah, I'd worry if we left it purely up to the subjectivity of people's hit or miss experiences of awe. I think it's kind of awe-inspiring what human beings can do when they all get together and decide to do something collectively. That is another example. And with the climate problems that we're facing and the environmental problems, we can look at the great successes we had in the past. It might have been a single issue situation, but the global community got together about CFCs and the ozone hole. It made a decision. It passed some legislation. Everybody agreed to abide by it, and we're fixing the ozone hole. So it's not impossible, but it does require supranational organization and trust, and that is quite awe-inspiring when it happens.
Although I think this is a good example of why you actually want, I think, the right dose of awe, right? We've been talking about all of the wonders of awe and so on, but when it comes to everyday practical issues like getting dinner on the table at 7 o'clock or trying to coordinate around some environmental issue, you also need the very pragmatic sorts of reasoning. If you think about something like curiosity, we can say how wonderful it is to be curious, but at the end of the day, we don't have the resources in terms of our own time and energy and ability to learn and so on to explore everything we might be curious about. So curiosity has to be very, very selective if it's actually going to be a good guide to our action in the world and to learning. And I think that's true for wonder and it's true for awe. So while a bit maybe is going to be great for this problem if it helps people appreciate our interdependence with the natural world and so on, and our relationship to other people. I think you also don't want it to go too far, right? I think the right level, you want the right dose of wonder in order to actually have effective action.
So there's been a suggestion among all of you that the more we learn about a subject, I mean, that mystery, that not knowing something is a key component of this experience of wonder that leads to the curiosity and all of that. And there's kind of an age-old debate about whether, as we keep learning more things about the world through science, whether that diminishes the experience of awe, as some of the Romantic poets, for instance, suggested. Does science, does knowledge get in the way of wonder or awe at all, or does it augment it?
My quick answer would be, though, that it's always receding. So no matter how far you go, you take a couple of steps towards understanding something and you cover some ground. But what you don't know then just extends down a little bit further. I was reading something recently about chlorophyll and how chlorophyll actually works. And we still aren't completely sure how we turn the sun's light into energy fully, but now people are starting to realize that it involves all kinds of quantum phenomena within the leaf, within every leaf. And as we move towards that, we're going to eventually get to a zone of unknowing or an uncertainty where you can't get any further. And similarly, in my own field of medicine, we're so far from even understanding the very beginnings of even how the immune system works, never mind how the brain works. So no matter how far you go towards something, the questions just open up.
What do you mean we don't understand how the immune system works?
Yeah, so one of the most significant medical problems we face are autoimmune conditions. So conditions like ulcerative colitis or rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis. And we don't know why. We don't really understand why the human immune system occasionally chooses to attack one part of itself. And so we're still treating these conditions by giving a generalized suppression of the immune system across the board. And we're starting to develop some more specific targeting molecules, but we're a long way from understanding what initiates it, never mind how to suppress it when it goes wrong.
So yeah, just to go back to this one. So a few years ago, I wrote this book called The Island of Knowledge, which I explore precisely this metaphor, which essentially is, if you think of what we know about the world is fitting in an island, this island grows. But then, as every good island, I know you're a big fan of islands, it's surrounded by an ocean, and in this case would be the ocean of the unknown, the stuff you don't know. And the paradox of learning is precisely that as the island grows, the boundaries between the known and the unknown also grow. Mm-hmm. And you become equipped to ask questions that you couldn't have contemplated before. So before there was quantum mechanics, you couldn't be talking about what happens with chlorophyll so these are questions that emerge with new knowledge, just like in any field of science or any field of of creativity really depends on this. So I think that's a wonderful thing, and because there is no end, it's an endless pursuit. So there's always space for embracing this mystery because there will always be new mysteries out there. And I find that some people find that depressing. Oh, does that mean I'll never know everything? I say, you bet you'll never know everything. So why bother? Well, because it's the process of engaging with not knowing that is really rewarding, not finding the final answer.
Are there certain areas in science that you think we will just never know, we will never understand?
Wow. Let me just throw that one at the, I mentioned the origin of the universe. Another one, which is kind of surprising, is I call it the problem of the three origins, right? The universe, life, and mind. So the origin of life, even if you are able to create life in the laboratory, right? Like you mix the right chemicals and then, hey, here it is, I made a bacteria of some kind. You cannot be sure if that is how life emerged here on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, because unless you can prove a theorem that says there is only one or two pathways towards life from a soup of biochemicals, which I don't think we can. So that's another, and the other one, I'll throw that one to you, is consciousness. What do you think about the hard problem of consciousness? I love that.
Easy question.
Easy question. I think we might actually solve the hard problem of consciousness, but it's just a bet. Part of the reason that I think that is because
we have to define our terms.
Sorry.
How would you explain what the hard
the
problem?
hard problem of consciousness is explaining in biological or scientific terms, how it is that we can have an experience of what something is like, right? So right now you're all having an experience of hearing a voice that has a particular kind of characteristic, of seeing things that have a particular kind of feeling, having all sorts of emotions internally and so on. Explaining how it is that things can have what it's like, a subjective experience associated with them, is thought to be one of the major challenges. And I think part of the reason it seems like a challenge is because we don't yet have a great theory. And part of the reason is because we don't yet have a good sense for what a theory would look like. And I'm willing to bet that our intuitions about what a satisfying explanation is might actually change. If you look historically, I think we now accept explanations that probably would have seemed magical, miraculous a couple of hundred years ago. And so I'm willing to believe that human cognition is sufficiently flexible that we'll actually come to find certain kinds of explanations satisfying. What I would think is...
Marcelo, I'm willing to bet you disagree.
No, actually, if you change the rules of the game, then everything's possible.
I'm allowing in human cognitive flexibility, right?
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
But I do think there's another whole class of problematic cases here, which are cases where we don't yet know how to ask the right questions, right? I mean, I think sometimes we see scientific progress because we discover there's new questions to ask that we weren't even asking. And so I worry about all of the questions we're not even asking yet, such that we don't yet appreciate that we have no idea what the answers are.
Can you give me an example of that, of a question that maybe we've just figured out we need to ask now that we didn't even think about decades ago?
So one place where maybe you see an interesting case of this is with machine intelligence and artificial intelligence. So I think for a long time we might have had the luxury or the problem of thinking about intelligence as being very, very human specific. And the minute you start taking non-human animal intelligence very seriously and machine intelligence very seriously, you might start asking new questions about intelligence. Just what does intelligence look like in a way that's not totally bound up with idiosyncratic properties of the biology that we happened to get as a result of our evolutionary history. And I think it'd be very hard to think about those questions if you weren't already taking non-human intelligence very seriously in the form of animals or machines.
Well, I've been struck by when I've talked with certain AI researchers, it seems like some decades ago the object was to essentially to use AI to understand how the human brain works. Maybe that's not really the point of it. Maybe neural networks will develop an entirely different kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with how the human brain works.
Right.
Yeah.
That is a very safe bet, I think. Yeah.
But will we even be able to really comprehend how that works if it's so different than how we think?
Yeah, I mean, little I know and have read about this, I feel very strongly it's almost like we're getting back to the chlorophyll question. At one point we're going to get to an area of neuroscience where it just seems to disappear down a rabbit hole of uncertainty. And consciousness seems, for my experience of it, to be such a totally different thing. It must be in some way emergent from the business of neuroscientific processes. I mean, it must be, because we know from all kinds of neurological and brain damage studies how consciousness is clouded by certain kinds of brain injuries. But that doesn't really help us understand how the thing arises in the first place. We just know that the organ that it emerges from can be damaged in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one comment about this that you mentioned, this machine learning and AI, is that one of the things that people are worried about, and some very smart people consider AI an existential risk for humanity, right? It's because the way this machine intelligence is being developed is that they get trained to learn patterns and to develop strategies to do something. So, for example, the machine that AlphaGo, right, the machine that beat the Go player, it did in ways that the people that programmed that machine did not understand. So the machine developed strategies like in let's call it a black box, right? And that is a little scary, right? Because it means that the machine is doing stuff that the programmers that we do not know what the steps were. And it beat the best guy, or one of the best guys, right? So the question is that real intelligence, or is that just a machine doing things, And that's a very complicated question. I don't know if there is an obvious answer to that. My answer to that is that is definitely not. So there are two kinds. There is artificial narrow intelligence and artificial general intelligence. So when people talk about the end of humanity as we know it, like Elon Musk, right, summoning the demon, whatever, that's the AGN, the artificial general intelligence. Like the machine is going to be smarter than we are. We are just this really wasteful stuff made of carbon. Who cares about these people? And we're just going to get rid of them because they are on our way. We want to understand why the universe exists, and people are just not, they're just cumbersome, right? So that sort of existential is very different from the machine learning stuff that you hear about all the time. And there is a huge, enormous disconnect between one and the other. Yeah. So it's really important to keep that in perspective.
And think very carefully about how we program these things, because a question you might ask the AI, the neural network might be, for example, how do we cut carbon footprint of the United States of America? And the answer might be have half the number of people, So you might get all kinds of odd answers that you weren't really hoping for or looking for.
Are there ethical dimensions to this whole discussion of awe and wonder? And I mean, does it lead to actions that we should take, appropriate behaviors that would make the world a better place? Or is it just kind of intellectual curiosity? It's cool to have these experiences.
Tanya said dissolves the boundaries. I thought that was really interesting ethical point of view. If something helps you dissolve the boundaries between you and other people, then surely that will make you think more about the common good. It might make you think more along the line of virtuous actions in terms of your own actions and their negative effects on others. I don't know.
Or maybe break down the boundaries between the in-group and the out-group.
Yeah. I mean, those are empirical questions that I don't know the answers to. But I think one thing that we do have reason to think is that the kind of humility that's involved with experiences of awe, which involve a recognition of what you don't know, might be very valuable in helping people bridge the sorts of debates that often seem very intractable. So there is some evidence that just getting people to appreciate that they don't really understand that policy very well, that they thought they really advocated very strongly, just getting them to realize that there is a sort of gap between their level of professed certainty about, say, a political view and what they actually understand about the mechanics of it can help people come together across these kinds of divides and have more productive conversations. And so I think that's one reason to think that maybe this is valuable, not in a very direct way, but in an indirect way, via the ways in which it might make us more open to other points of view and the way it might prompt further inquiry, right? If awe is part of the basic research capacities of humanity, we don't always know what the downstream consequences of pursuing that are going to be, just as we don't in science. But if you look historically, all of our great advances have come from having a focus on really just trying to understand the world around us. And so,
but that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
You're really making the case for uncertainty,
mm-hmm.
for the value of uncertainty, and that leads to very positive outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the example of religion and all related to that, right? I mean, different kinds of religions do come with sort of a moral code of behavior. They sometimes clash with one another, but they do have one. And a lot of that is motivated by us. So if you take that model and you make it secular and you say, perhaps now what we should be doing is we should be creating a reconnection of our species with the natural world because our world is sick and we are really making it even sicker and we are not paying attention to that. And it is a real serious existential risk. And if we relate to the awe of the world that exists out there and us being part of that, and we use that to perhaps rescue some new sort of morality, then you can say that, yes, there is a new ethics that would emerge from this, which is the ethics of us, the human species, not this tribe against that tribe, the human species as guardians of the planet and of all forms of life in it, because this is the only one we have. And it's the only one where we can survive for a very, very long time. And that is secular, and that is very necessary, I think, for us to survive the next few days. And that's coming from, I think, a connection of awe and the relationship with the natural world.
Well, it raises an interesting question about the responsibility of scientists, whether, I mean, we're also getting into questions of meaning and purpose here, which is often considered kind of beyond the purview of what science is all about. I mean, scientists traditionally, and they're trying to understand how things work, but is that a mistake? I mean, is there a responsibility for scientists to take on some of these questions to figure out how these ideas apply to the larger world to make it better?
Well, my position is absolutely, we do. And the problem is that there are different ways. Scientists are just like everybody else. We have different opinions about things, right? So a lot of my colleagues would say, what is this guy talking about? We should just, we live in the, what I call the Copernican narrative, which is basically the idea that the more we know about the universe, the less important we become. And I think that narrative has to change, because it's really the opposite. The more we know about the universe, the more relevant and more important we become, because we are these molecular machines that are capable of self-awareness. And as far as we know, there aren't any other ones like that. And so that gives us a new moral directive, imperative really, to kind of understand that we actually do have a role in this planet right now. But not everybody will agree with me, because they're thinking about the multiverse and there are many other universes out there, or let's colonize Mars, and I'm thinking, no, look at this place. No, we don't even understand our biome, right? I mean, how are we going to colonize Mars without all the biomes that we carry with us? Right? It's
there's also something there about the internationalism of science, that the scientific cooperation, a good example would be the Cold War, where there's still people managed to forge scientific connections of trust across the Iron Curtain, because they had an idea or a vision of something greater that was a common goal for humanity. And so I think very powerfully that science has an obligation to try to maintain that code of ethics among itself, to not be politicized, to not let themselves be politicized as scientists, even though we're dependent on tax dollars and all the rest of it, that there is another kind of loyalty to an ideal which is much more international and is much more long scale. Again, come back to my own field in medicine. All the great advances in medicine have been in things like public health, vaccination, not in new chemotherapies and so on. But even just with public health and vaccination and a little more understanding of nutrition, a little more understanding of communicable disease, over the course of the 20th century, we doubled human life expectancy. Just in 1 century. So human life expectancy increased as much in the 20th century as it did in the previous 8,000 years. And that's just thanks to simple things. Now we think of them as simple. And so that kind of approach to sharing that kind of knowledge can have wonderful, wonderful repercussions for us as a species.
I'm assuming you would say as a doctor that you have to have an ethical perspective on what you do. I mean, it's sort of, I'm guessing it would be impossible not to do that, to practice medicine.
Yeah, I think so. And it can be very distorted, particularly by financial questions in the consulting room. I practice medicine in the UK. We have a national health service, a very different medical system. The way it's paid for is very different here. And I really like the fact that when I see my patients, I don't need to think about their wallet at all, because I'm paid from somewhere else. And they trust me more because they know I'm not going to get paid more if I recommend a certain kind of treatment. And so that's the model that I'm used to, and I really, really appreciate that model. I don't see how you can separate an ethical dimension from the practice of medicine. And the way in which people manage to maintain their love for the profession or get burnout has a lot to do with when they start to lose sight of the value of what they're doing, start to change the way they behave for different kinds of groups of patients, for example.
So I do think we need to qualify this, though, right? I mean, I think we're all familiar with the phenomenon of people stepping outside their area of expertise and maybe seeming like they have some authority because they're very established in one field, right? So celebrities might comment on vaccines, but they're probably not the people you should defer to for your best knowledge on vaccines. And I think someone can be a terrific scientist, but that doesn't mean that they have expertise in policy. It doesn't mean that they have expertise in ethical issues. I think for some of those questions, you want to look to the relevant kinds of expertise. I think a scientist can acquire that kind of expertise, right? So somebody who's a physicist can acquire a lot of sophisticated philosophical thinking and ethical thinking and so on. But insofar as they're doing that, they're doing ethics or they're doing policy, right? So I do think there's a bit of a danger here of thinking that because many things should be evidence-based and based on science, that scientists should be the ones making these decisions. I think they should only make them to the extent they have the relevant expertise.
Absolutely.
And, but then what's the role of government in allowing the scientists to pursue the questions they want to pursue? That's a very interesting one too. If something is tax-funded, then governments are putting the money into the scientists' funds are going to want to possibly direct the way the science goes.
Right. I mean, I think it might well be that the questions we ask as scientists are going to be influenced by all sorts of ethical issues and practical issues. But the answers we give to those empirical questions shouldn't be influenced by the ethical issues. And it doesn't mean that the scientists are necessarily the people in the best position to figure out how what they discover should translate into, for example, environmental policy. I mean, surely we want our environmental policy to be informed by science, and there's no question about that. But all sorts of extra questions about what we value and what kinds of trade-offs we're going to make in terms of quality of life and people's values come in too. And so I think there's room for different kinds of expertise, and we need to work together. So you can have, I have a perspective where we really want things to be grounded in science to the extent we can, but we also don't want to overstate what the science on its own tells us. It's the science plus lots of practical considerations plus our values and a lot of other things that are going to actually translate into collective action.
I have one last question before we open it up to the audience, and I'm going to ask each of you to respond to this. I mean, it strikes me that you were all explorers in one way or another of the cosmos, of the mind, of the body, and you've all been talking about sort of exploring unknown territories. So what do you consider the most exciting unknown territory that each of you is exploring, whether you yourself or your field? Marcella?
So the way physics is constructed is really about the dance of energy, right? So how energy mutates itself from small particles to stars to the universe as a whole, right? So this has been the story that we tell, and we tell it really well, and we're very good at this. But now we live in the age of information. So one of the questions that we have is, what about information? Is there some sort of coded information in nature? So when something has a shape, does it have an information related to that shape? And can we use the information that is stored in the structures that exist in the universe, from a particle to a galaxy, to tell us a parallel story to the one that energy tells, So it would be sort of an informational account of what's going on. And basically the idea is that you have simple structures and complex structures, and you want to understand how the universe that was essentially much simpler when it was younger than it is now, how this simplicity became this emergent complex that we see now. And information theory may have a lot to say about that. So that's something that I'm very interested in.
Tanya, what about you?
Well, so if we think about all of us right now in this room, we're all occupying a very particular spatiotemporal moment. We have a lot of the same experience. You're hearing my voice. You're seeing similar sorts of spatial and visual information. And if we were to try to correlate the brain activity of those of you in the audience now, it would be more correlated with each other than it would be with somebody in another room. And I think we've done a fairly good job understanding how it is that the immediate stimuli in your environment affect what's going on in your head. But the other thing that you are all intimately aware of is that there's a lot more going on in your head too that's not particularly tied to this particular time and space. You might be thinking about the future. You might be thinking about the past. You might be having all sorts of emotional experiences. You might be having all sorts of mental images. All sorts of things that are not tied to the stimuli that you are being exposed to at this very moment. And it's probably different for all of you. And I think we have a lot of unknown questions about what's the logic of those kinds of processes. We have some sense of how the immediate is impacting you, but all of that thought that's not immediately stimulus dependent. What's driving that? What role is it playing for you? Why is it different for those of you who are here, even though you're in the same environment? So I think that's related to human consciousness, but a specific aspect of it that I think we're just beginning to try to understand.
Yeah,
Gavin?
for me is something related in a way, in that, I work as a general physician, a family physician. About a third of my consultations involve people that have got some kind of mental health issue. And we still understand almost nothing, really, about mental illness. Like particularly mood disorders, disorders of the emotion. We don't really understand what makes our moods go up and down. And I love the idea, Sartre said that they were magical transformations of the world. Like your mood is a magical transformation. You have the same experience walking down a particular street when you're happy. If you walk down the same street, same weather, but your mood is different, everything is transformed. And we don't understand the first thing about that. So what I'm seeing right now in the practice of medicine is a kind of coming to realize, coming to awareness, a certain humility about the fact that we're still using the same drugs after 40 or 50 years to treat most mental illnesses. And we really need a radically new way of thinking about mood and emotion and how our experience of that varies from day to day and how we can become ill and how we can become better again. So that's what I'm really enjoying reading about just now.
Okay, I'm willing to bet that this has sparked a few questions from our audience. So there. Well, and actually, it's interesting that you say that. So, Gavin, when you were just talking about we need new models, maybe new drugs to treat mental illness, there is this concerted effort now looking at psychedelics specifically to treat depression.
Yeah. We've been here before with psychedelics. In the 60s and 70s, they were tried for all sorts of things. There was a lot of optimism for a while, and they're helping alcoholism. They're still very, very controversial territory because they're so context dependent. So the number of people who have a bad trip is substantial and significant, and still of the order of a few percent, I think, but that's a lot when you get into the orders of treating a lot of people. So using these kind of things is really hard to disentangle from the context of being in this wonderful place where you're in a protected space, where you've got a dedicated therapist and where everybody's around you trying to help you get through this particularly traumatic experience. If you reproduce that without the drug, you would probably find quite good outcomes too. I'm thinking of a parallel way back 70, 80 years ago. There were some really positive results started coming out about using insulin shock therapy. Remember, when they just discovered insulin and they discovered how to that they could use it, had these incredibly powerful effects on the body. It was resurrecting people who were on the brink of death with diabetes. They started to use it in mental illness, and they had very good results. And then later on, they realized that actually they were getting good results because of all the extra care and attention these people were getting who were having insulin shock therapy. So I'm sure it has a very powerful experience for some. And a lot of people have been through a traumatic experience, self-medicate with hallucinogens. Absolutely, because it transforms the world. It gives them a magical transformation of the world. But I'm not sure how useful it's going to be long-term as a psychiatric drug for the majority of my patients I see in mental distress. Yeah.
Can I say, I was smiling because my wife is a psychotherapist, and there is there is a huge movement here in the United States about this, about what you're saying. And there is a documentary called From Shock to Awe, which you can get at Netflix, which is about soldiers being treated with very severe PTSD and with ayahuasca. And they do go through a bad trip because the whole process of this ritual is to go through a bad trip, because the bad trip is the washing out of all the bad experience that you have accumulated over the years. And those fellows that were hardly functioning in society really became transformed. And, the Michael Pollan book, obviously, right? The How to Change Your Mind, which is where this thing really started to catch fire. And I'm not the expert at all, as you mentioned, but there seems to be a lot of very serious people, including Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University, who is one of the best medical schools in the country, that has been doing this. And it's kind of interesting and very promising in many ways.
No, it's fascinating, but I'm really interested in the language you're using too. So let's come back to it in 4 or 5 years' time and see whether the effects were enduring, and see if there's ways of disentangling just the drug from all the extra care, from these brilliant and wonderful and very therapeutic and very powerful metaphors, like washing out all the misery, that kind of cathartic thing. People used exactly the same terminology for ECT when it came in. It was electroconvulsive therapy, that it gave a catharsis. Let's see.
But that didn't give you a sense of awe and connection with the universe in a benevolent, higher spiritual way.
No, but what they said it did was it gave you amnesia for all the miserable aspects of your life.
Can I just interject for a moment? I've talked with Jane Goodall, and she has reported this experience of walking past a group of chimpanzees at a waterfall, and that they will react in a couple of different ways. One way is to stop and just be absolutely silent and just stay and watch for an extended period of time. The other way is that sometimes they bristle and sort of they act very excited. And her theory is that this is an experience of awe, and she speculates, this is total speculation, that this might suggest something about the origins of religious experience.
I mean, I'd be inclined to think that for a lot of cases of non-human cognition and non-human experience compared to human experience, it's a difference of degree rather than a difference in kind. So I described a moment ago how all the things going on in your minds right now in the audience are partially dependent on your immediate stimuli, but there's also lots of other things going on. And I think one dimension along which we might vary as sort of outliers in the animal world is the extent to which our experience is stimulus independent, right? Not just a function of the immediate here and now. And awe might have characteristics of that. But I do think it's a difference in degree. I think other forms of non-human cognition are going to vary in the extent to which their experience and cognitive processes are governed by their immediate stimuli and their immediate history of stimuli versus the other sorts of things that we don't yet know how to explain for human cognition. If there is empirical research on that, I don't know of it. It doesn't mean it's not out there. So if you're thinking about a causal direction, I imagine you're thinking that déjà vu might be the cause of awe. And that does seem more plausible to me than the reverse. I mean, there's a way in which déjà vu is very much tied to our specific here and now experience, whereas awe is quite removed from that. And so if I had to speculate, it would be that sometimes a déjà vu experience might lead to some sort of sense of there being something else going on that you don't quite understand. But that is just speculation. Well, so one piece of it, I think, is that awe does tend to involve a sense that you don't understand, a sense that you're small with respect to things, a sense that you are a speck with respect to things. And so part of that is a kind of lack of agency or a lack of power. So I think in this previous sort of continuum I sort of gestured at, where you might have awe versus curiosity, I think curiosity is a very agentive kind of feeling. It directs you to do something, to have control over your environment. Awe, I think, tends not to have that. It tends to sort of be something that you experience as coming at you rather than you doing something to the environment. And so I would imagine that you would experience less free will, less of a sense of agency and control with an awe experience compared to a curiosity experience, which is going to be quite similar along some other dimensions.
I understand from your question, I suppose you're asking about the subjectivity of different people's experiences of awe or wonder that can be very different, very context dependent, and also a little bit about the kind of wonder or awe that we feel in religious contexts, like whether it be a meditation, transcendental meditation, or a prayer kind of approach, one that gives you access to that feeling without having to go out and see something which you perceive or consider to be wonderful. You can just, by breathing and being and quietening your mind, you can experience it. And I think that's very powerful. If that was more widespread, that more people were involved in trying to access that sense of peace and wonder just internally, yes, it's very powerful. But as to whether you feel really, really big or really, really small, I think they're probably both it's probably a circle. They both meet one another at the other end. That it doesn't really matter whether you feel big or whether you feel small. It's just the fact that you feel different and you feel borders are dissolving, and that's probably what the important aspect of that experience is. Yeah.
So I think what you're describing really brings to light one of the things that's an enormous challenge about the hard problem of consciousness, which is that part of what's built in to consciousness as we're describing it here is that you access it in this first person direct way that you have privileged access to, right? So you know what's going on in your head in a way that I don't know what's going on in your head. And I could put you in a brain scanner and I could be the world's most advanced neuroscientist. And there might still be a sense in which if I say you are experiencing red, but you tell me you're experiencing blue, it feels like you have the authority there, right? Like I've messed up as the scientist if it doesn't match what you, from your privileged first-person perspective, are reporting. And so I think that is a major challenge for consciousness. But I think there's another part of this problem, which is just the way science proceeds for any domain, which is that we make our best guesses about what might be going on and what the right distinctions are to make and what the right questions to ask are. And then we go out and we do our empirical studies and we discover that it works pretty well, or that we discover that it doesn't work that well, and we have to go back and revise it, right? So I think for any science, it's true that we don't start out knowing the right questions and the right distinctions and the right way to carve up the things that exist in the world. For every science, it's a process of trying to come up with hypotheses, seeing what the world tells us as we go out and explore, and then revising those. And I think that aspect is going to be exactly the same. We're going to have to start out with certain assumptions. They're either going to work well for us in that they allow us to understand other people's experience, predict their behavior, treat mental health issues, or they don't. And to the extent they don't, we're going to have to question those kinds of assumptions. So there is empirical evidence on a lot of that. So for the first part of your question, there are cheap ways to get a sense of understanding that you might not think is actual understanding, but it is definitely not restricted to religion. So one example is that people like neuroscientific explanations for the human mind that appeal to neuroscience jargon. They don't understand the neuroscience jargon, but it sort of seems sciencey and compelling and so on. So I think the error of mistaking a sense of understanding for understanding is sadly quite general. It might be that religion does exhibit it, but so do other things. There is quite a lot of research on individual variation and religiosity. You do find variation across cultures, but there are so many socio-historical factors at play there that I think the more interesting cases are where you find variation across individuals within a culture. And some of the things that you find there are that people tend to be more religious if they tend to think about the world in more sort of psychological, intentional terms. If you're the sort of person who's inclined to describe things like having mental states and emotions, so your computer is mad at you and so on, the weather is angry. People who tend to take their intuition and immediate gut responses to be a serious and legitimate guide to their thoughts and feelings and everyday decisions. So people who tend to be more reflective and question what seems like the default view are less likely to be religious, in at least in the US. There's a number of characteristics like this, but I think overwhelmingly what the psychological research suggests is that the cognitive capacities that seem to support religious belief are actually present in all of us, just to varying degrees. And so really the striking thing is the extent to which you find similarities in human cognition with respect to these capacities, and then sometimes they manifest in religious belief versus not, but the underlying cognitive machinery tends to be quite similar with respect to a lot of this.
And I wanted to add that there's also an evolutionary aspect to the question, because if you think about the kinds of animals that we are, I think one of the most fundamental characteristics that we humans have is that we're storytelling animals. We tell stories, and if you go back, 20, 30,000 years, there were lots of things that were incomprehensible, very scary about the natural world when you were a hunter-gatherer trying to survive, and nature was very threatening, but it was also very giving because it had the animals and the fruits, but then it could also be destroyed very quickly. And that sort of lack of agency over the natural forces led people to create a sort of language, a bridge between us here with our mysteries and misunderstandings of what's going on and whatever mysterious forces caused all that. So in a sense, at least from an origins perspective, a lot of religion can be attributed to a way of building a sort of connection with whatever forces caused all these things that we depended on, and the ritual that was part of the religion, right, was a way of communicating with the agents of those actions that were unexplainable, like the gods, right? And there was also, in the tribes, and this is true now, there was also the shaman, the translator, the person that would understand the language of the gods and translate it to us, so us meaning the rest of the tribe, so that we could understand what was going on. So you make offerings and the shaman does that. So it was really a form of creating or attempting to create some sort of agency over factors that were much more powerful than we are. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily just a cheap way of understanding the incomprehensible, but it was a way of trying to have the illusion, or perhaps, but the belief in some sort of power over the forces that we couldn't control, And I think that's still true to a large extent. I mean, a lot of people in a lot of religions, for example, deal with death and loss, right? Which is something that we have very little control over. Yes, we doubled our life expectancy, but we're all going to die. Right, there is no question about this, right? Unless you are Ray Kurzweil, but apart from him, most of us will. And so, how do we deal with that? So we create ways of coping with these mechanisms, And religion has a lot to say about these things too.
Yeah, and I think we touched on it a little bit earlier about the idea that in English, anyway, awe has got this real connotation or hint of fear in it. I mean, it comes from a kind of apprehension of some huge, overwhelming power that's got a tint of fear. And, the tradition that I'm most familiar with is more the Judeo-Christian tradition. You can really see that in the Old Testament. There's this kind of power which is quite threatening sometimes. You can see it in the Greek myths as well, retribution from the gods, that you have to propitiate the gods. And I think we've seen an evolution in religions on the Judeo-Christian side of that, moving from fear more to this kind of philosophy, much more of love and inclusion and community. You can see that development. And I think that is something that's helping us build this, that heritage is helping us build this idea of dissolving boundaries and internationalism and the possibilities of science more broadly.
We could go on for another hour, but we have no more time. So I want to thank our wonderful panel. Thank you, all of you.